Good evening, guys. Wanted to put this one out. This one is funny. Um, this happened back in 2017, and this was posted 6 days ago, which means the trial of these police officers are still going on. Go figure. It drives me crazy. But this one is for Tempe. He'll get a kick out of this one. Hopefully it'll make him laugh. Tempe against police violence. And the other two guys that were arrested during the protest here in Chandler. Watch this one. It's funny.
Three police officers are on trial in St. Louis accused of brutally beating one of their own. In September of 2017, Detective Luther Hall was working undercover at a protest that erupted after a local police officer was found not guilty of murdering a black man that he shot after a car chase. So while at the demonstration, Hall was severely beaten by a group of police officers who say that they thought he was a protester. The trial against
Go figure. In every protest, they put undercover officers in there to try and arrest the instigators of the protest.
Three of those officers is in its second week. Following this story for us now is investigative reporter Lauren Traeger from our St. Louis affiliate. Thank you so much for joining us, Lauren. Man, this is a really, really interesting and disturbing case that I am surprised has not risen to the level of a national story. So that being said, many people may not have heard of this story, particularly because, the incident happened back in 2017. So bring us up to speed. What happened to Luther Hall back then?
Well, I think you make an excellent point. It really has not gained a lot of national attention. That's been kind of surprising to us here in the local media as well. And I think you kind of summarized it pretty well. There was some community outrage over that trial where that officer was acquitted in that murder case. So Luther Hall is a St. Louis police officer. He is African American. He was assigned that night as a detective to work undercover. So there were protests that evening. He was there not, he says, to monitor the protesters, but to gather evidence of potential crime. So if there was property damage or people who were looking to harm others, he was there blending in with the protesters. He was in plain clothes. He did not have his duty weapon with him. And he was filming, just as many protesters do, of course. So he was blending into the crowd. And on the stand during this trial, he very emotionally described what he says happened to him, which was essentially in a very short time. He says he was rushed by a group of officers. All 5 officers who have been charged in this case are white. 3 of them still remain on trial right now. And
White.
Luther Hall says in just a matter of 15 or 20 seconds,
Go
he
figure.
was taken to the ground, he was arrested, and in the process, pretty severely beaten and injured. He had significant injuries to his face, to his body, and he's had residual impacts from those injuries to this day. Some plates in his neck and near his shoulders. He's had pancreatitis, can still have some difficulties eating from all of this. And notably, he did have a partner that night as well, who is white and also undercover. They were not together at the time, but the partner also took the stand and testified that he too was arrested that night as a potential protester, but he was arrested by black officers, and he claimed it was a completely textbook arrest. He was not injured in any single way. So some of the local community outrage here, of course, has been that Luther Hall was beaten because these officers, it's alleged, believed he was a protester and just simply a black man. And that's certainly been a lot of the testimony that's been coming out in this trial.
Yeah, so the trial, there's 3 officers on trial, but they weren't the only officers implicated in his beating. At least one other officer has he's already pleaded guilty. How did he explain himself on the stand? Because the other thing that happened too is, these officers weren't exactly upfront about what happened.
Yeah, I mean, certainly as part of the allegations from the prosecutors here is that the officers themselves had exchanged some text.
Go figure. They're not up front about exactly what happened. Typical.
messages prior to the protests even starting indicating that they wanted to beat up protesters. Essentially, that's what some of the text messages, according to the prosecutors, indicate. That officer that you mentioned.
So they sent text messages to each other. When we're down there at the protest, we'll pick some people out and beat the fuck out of them. Go figure.
Now former officer Randy Hayes. He has since pleaded guilty, and he was questioned very significantly by the defense because initially he had said that Luther Hall was resisting or wouldn't put his hands up, wasn't complying with the arrest, and that's why they had to use some amount of force to effect the arrest. On the stand, he completely did a 180 and said, I was in the wrong. He said, upon hindsight and recollection, I was in the wrong, and Luther Hall was not resisting arrest in any way. So he did change his mind. Now, again, it's important to kind of note here that he's already pleaded guilty. He did indicate he's seeking a more lenient sentence from the federal court because he is seeing potential prison time just like these other officers are. So the defense was kind of hammering on that, saying, did you just change your mind so that you could get a better deal? But he again was saying, no, I need to come up here and tell the truth that Luther Hall was not resisting arrest when we used force on him.
So far the trial's been going on for 2 weeks. I was seeing some of the coverage from your station, and there's been suggestions that it's dragging on too long. Where does the case stand now, and how long is it expected to last?
We did get some indications yesterday that it might be starting to wrap up. The defense initially had said they were going to call up to 30 witnesses, and they have now told the judge that may not be the case. The prosecution still has the case, so they have a few more witnesses they want to call before it would go over to the defense. It's interesting here because there are 3 defendants, 3 separate officers. Each of them have their own defense attorney and are clearly taking their own defense strategies. Some of them are saying, my officer was nowhere even near the scene. Some of them are saying perhaps Luther Hall did, in some ways, have some culpability in this as well. So they're each taking different strategies, which is causing the trial to go on a little bit longer. So I do think it could wrap up perhaps by the end of this week, likely into next week. But it will, of course, be up to a jury to decide whether or not these officers will be held accountable. And part of the big concern about this particular case, when this jury was picked, it is an all-white jury with only 2 black alternates. So far, it doesn't look like they're going to get to weigh in on this case. So a lot of people are sort of watching the outcome to see really where this will go. And perhaps one of the officers may be found guilty. Perhaps none of them will. It's still really up in the air at this particular time.
Sort of reading about this case, I thought a few things. How damaging this case is going to be for the relationship between the community and the police department, which, you don't need any more incidents to sort of damage that relationship. But then also I thought about the rank and file and just how they're reacting to this information. Do we know how the rank and file police officers, their take on this case?
There's an interesting kind of component to this. There are 2 unions that represent officers in the city of St. Louis. One represents a lot of the officers, and one represents particularly the black officers. And they have made some remarks that union.
They have 2. One that represents most of the officers, and then they have one that represents just the black officers. I wonder why.
Has said they think it's sort of interesting that there is silence from a lot of the rank and file and even from the leadership, that they have not spoken out in support of Luther Hall, that there has just kind of been a lot of silence about this particular case. And I think that's part of the question for the community here is when we talk about a blue line and supporting police officers in their job, does that blue line extend to black police officers given this particular situation? So there are certainly those folks who are saying, we really need to look at this. This is really an issue. But from the community standpoint, too, I've also seen some people who say, perhaps police need to look at their tactics. Do they need to have an undercover officer there at all? Because they feel like it was meant to monitor the protest community only. And there's some people that are maybe not.
Okay, guys, this is pretty much over. Just wanted to put this out for Tempe.